The assault on Outpost Theta 7 began without warning. One moment, the human settlers were going about their evening routines under the dual suns of the Proxima Centauri system, and the next, the sky was tearing open. A massive Krelthian dreadnought, a living ship of chitin and organic cannon barrels, descended through the atmosphere, its arrival announced by a bone-rattling hum that vibrated in the teeth of every man, woman, and child in the colony. Alarms blared, the sound both mechanical and desperate. The Outpost, a collection of sturdy prefabricated habitats and hydroponic domes, was designed for self-sufficiency and scientific research, not war. It housed 230 souls, geologists, botanists, engineers, and their families. They had a single patched-together defense platform orbiting the planet, a relic from the initial landing phase, and a handful of shuttlecraft retrofitted with mining lasers. Governor Elias Vance, a man whose face was more accustomed to smiling at new crop yields than scowling at enemy ships, stared at the main tactical display in the command center. The Krelthian vessel was a nightmare given form, a city-sized organism bristling with weaponry. It didn't look like a machine. It looked like a living creature bred for war. The Krelthian Empire, they knew from fragmented deep space transmissions, was a dominant power in this spiral arm. Yet they absorbed or annihilated any species they deemed unworthy or a threat. Humanity, so new to the galactic stage, had apparently just been deemed both. "They're hailing us on all frequencies," a young communications officer, her voice tight with controlled fear, reported. "On speaker," Vance ordered, his own voice calm, a practiced steadiness he was far from feeling. The speakers crackled, and then a voice, cold and slick like oil on water, filled the room. It was a translation, clinical and devoid of emotion. "Unidentified biological entities. You occupy a world within the claimed territory of the Krelthian Empire. Your species is unknown, your technology primitive. By the right of expansion and genetic purity, your presence here is terminated. You will offer no resistance. Your matter will be recycled. Your genetic material will be cataloged and stored. This is not a negotiation. It is a statement of fact." The transmission ended. On the screen, they could see the dreadnought's primary weapon, a massive organic cannon, beginning to glow with a sickly, violet light. It was charging. Vance looked around the room at the faces of his people. He saw a young father, a botanist, clutching a picture of his wife and daughter back in the hydroponic section. He saw an old engineer, a veteran of the first Martian colonies, his gnarled hands already working on jury-rigging additional power to the Outpost's shields. He saw the terror in their eyes, but beneath it, he saw something else. A stubborn, incredulous refusal to accept this as their end. They had crossed 50 trillion miles of empty space to build this life. They had terraformed Martian dust, bled on lunar rocks, and dreamed of a future written in the stars. They were not going to be simply recycled. "They're not asking us to surrender," the comms officer whispered. "They're just telling us we're going to die." "They've made a mistake," Vance said, the idea forming in his mind. A desperate, almost insane gamble. "They've told us their intent, but they haven't asked a single question. They haven't tried to understand us. They see our technology and think it defines us. They see our small numbers and think it measures our strength. They don't know what we are." He turned to the engineer. "Marcus, can you get me a direct, unbreakable, tight beam link to the long-range communications array? I need to send a message, not to the fleet. They're too far away. I need to send it everywhere." The first Krelthian assault wave was not a ground invasion. It was an orbital bombardment designed to sterilize the surface. Beams of crackling energy lanced down from the dreadnought, turning the carefully cultivated fields outside the habitat dome into glass. The ground shook, The lights flickered, and the atmospheric processors strained to filter the sudden influx of ozone and burnt silica. It was a display of overwhelming and impersonal power, the kind that had cowed a dozen other species into submission. Inside the bunker-like command center, Governor Vance's message was being prepared. It wasn't a plea for help, nor a formal surrender. It was something far simpler and far more dangerous. While the Krelthian commander, a being called a synth mind, a collective consciousness grown specifically to command the dreadnought, observed the planet's surface through its organic sensors, and it felt a flicker of what might be called surprise. The primitive structures were still standing. A shimmering, fragile-looking energy field, clearly powered by a source far too small for the task, was deflecting the worst of the bombardment. The outpost was diverting every joule of power from its reactors, its greenhouses, its life support, all into the shields. They were buying time. For what? The synth mind wondered. Its tactical matrix calculated all possible outcomes, and there were no human warships in the system. Their FTL capabilities were laughably slow. There was no escape, no reinforcement. Their actions were illogical. They were simply delaying the inevitable. On the surface, Vance finished recording. He looked directly into the camera lens, his eyes holding the weight of 230 lives and the entire future of his species. He didn't speak of territory or rights. He spoke of people. My name is Elias Vance, the governor of Proxima Centauri Outpost Theta 7. We are under attack by a species that calls itself the Krelthian Empire. They have not asked for our surrender. They have not offered us a choice. They have declared us unworthy of existence. To any human listening, to any ship that can hear this, know this. We will not go quietly. We will fight with everything we have. But more importantly, know this about the Krelthians. They are powerful. Their technology is advanced. But they made a critical error today. They saw our ships and our guns and made a judgment. They did not ask about our history. They did not ask about our art, our music, our capacity for love, or our stubborn, foolish, glorious refusal to accept the word impossible. They judged us by our tools, not by our spirit. That is their weakness. Remember it. If this message reaches you, and if one day you face them, remember that. For every human who hears this is not a cry for help. Yes, it's a warning. For them. He paused, and a small, tired smile touched his lips. Tell our families we love them. Vance out. The message was encoded and blasted out on every human frequency, a tight beam of data aimed not at any single receiver, but at the relay satellites humanity had scattered across the colonized systems. It would take hours, days, even weeks to reach the core worlds. But it was sent. The seed was planted. On the Krelthian dreadnought, the synth mind detected the energy spike of the transmission. It analyzed its content quickly, a final, sentimental broadcast, meaningless. It confirmed its initial assessment. The humans were a young, emotional species, prone to irrational behavior, easy to break. It ordered the bombardment to intensify, focusing on the shield generator. The battle for Outpost Theta 7 was, by any military metric, already lost. But the battle for something far larger had just begun. And the Krelthians, in their supreme confidence, had no idea they had just lit a fuse that led straight back to their own heart. While the violet beams of the Krelthian dreadnought continued to hammer the failing shields of Outpost Theta 7, a frantic, desperate kind of activity seized the human settlers. They knew the shields wouldn't last. The reactor was overheating, the conduits were melting. They had minutes, maybe an hour at most. But humans, when faced with the impossible, have a curious tendency to redefine the possible. Governor Vance's message had galvanized them. It wasn't a call to arms, it was a call to defiance. They might die, but they would die on their own terms, and they would make sure their death meant something. In the Outpost's garage, a group of mechanics and pilots were working on the shuttles. These weren't warships. They were bulky, slow transport craft, designed to carry ore samples and scientific equipment. But they had maneuvering thrusters and hulls strong enough for atmospheric re-entry, and they had mining lasers. "We can't hurt that thing," a young pilot named Chen said, staring at the holographic schematic of the dreadnought on the garage wall. "Its hull is meters thick. Our lasers are for cutting rock." "Then we don't aim for the hull," Marcus, the old engineer, grunted, welding a reinforced plating onto a shuttle's nose. "We aim for the squishy bits. Look." He pointed at the schematic. "The synth mind, that's their commander. The Krelthian ships are biological. They have orifices, sensor ports, weapon apertures. They're like a giant armored animal. And animals, they can be distracted. They can be hurt." Meanwhile, in the command center, Vance was on a private channel with the head of the Outpost's scientific division, Dr. Eris Thorne. Thorne was an astrophysicist, a man whose mind operated in dimensions most people couldn't fathom. He was pale, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes held a terrifying clarity. "You're sure about this, Eris?" Vance asked, his voice low. Thorne nodded. "The theory is sound. We've been running simulations for years. The quantum resonance field. If we can create a localized, high-intensity disruption, we could theoretically encourage a cascade failure in any FTL drive within a significant radius. It's never been tested. And it requires a power source we don't have, and a delivery system we can't build." Vance looked at the power readings for the Outpost's main reactor, the one that was currently melting down to keep their shields alive. "What if we had a massive, uncontrolled release of energy? Like a reactor going critical?" Thorne's eyes widened. "The resonance would be chaotic, unpredictable, but if we could direct it even a little, it would be a beacon, a screaming flare in subspace. It wouldn't just affect a drive in orbit. It would propagate. The energy would have to go somewhere." "How far?" Vance asked. "I don't know. Light hours, maybe. If the conditions were perfect, light years." He swallowed hard. "Elias, you're talking about turning our own death into a bomb, a message that travels faster than light." "They sent a message," Vance said, looking back at the view screen showing the relentless assault. "They said they were going to recycle us. I just want to make sure everyone hears our reply." The Krelthian synth mind felt a flicker of irritation. The human shields were degrading, but slower than projected. The primitive creatures were rerouting power with a frantic, desperate ingenuity that was inefficient but annoying. It decided to end the farce. It would deploy ground assault organisms. The synth mind would observe the extinction of this species firsthand and catalog their death sounds for its genetic memory banks. The huge hatches on the dreadnought's underbelly irised open, and from them dropped scores of Krelthian drones. They were nightmare creatures, blending insectoid and reptilian features, with razor-sharp claws and biological projectile launchers that spat globs of corrosive acid. They fell through the atmosphere like meteors, their hardened chitin glowing red-hot before cooling. They landed around the perimeter of the outpost, and their multifaceted eyes taking in the shattered domes and the shimmering, failing shield. They began to advance, a wave of chitin and death. Inside, the outpost became a hive of final, desperate action. Chen and 3 other pilots scrambled into their shuttles. They weren't planning on dogfighting the dreadnought. Their plan was simpler, more insane. They were going to fly straight at it, using their shuttles as guided missiles, aiming their mining lasers not to cut, but to blind, to distract. On the ground, every colonist who could hold a tool or a weapon took up a position. Farmers with plasma cutters, geologists with seismic charges, cooks with cleavers. They fortified the habitat doors, their faces grim, their fear transmuted into a cold, hard readiness. They would sell their lives. They would make it cost more than the Krelthians ever imagined. In the reactor core, Vance and Thorne worked side by side with the remaining engineering team. The heat was unbearable. Radiation alarms were screaming. They were bypassing every safety protocol, rerouting the core's output not to the shields, but to the experimental quantum resonator Thorne had hastily assembled from spare parts and scientific instruments. It was a jury-rigged nightmare of cables and crystals, but it was their only hope. Not a hope of survival, but a hope of vengeance. As the first Krelthian drone clawed its way through an outer airlock, the desperate human defense began. It wasn't a battle. It was a brutal, close-quarters brawl. Chen's shuttle was the first to launch. It shot out of the bay, its engines screaming, and climbed straight towards the belly of the beast. The Krelthian dreadnought, focusing on the ground assault, was slow to react. Point defense organisms on its hull began to track the tiny craft. But Chen was flying low and fast, hugging the terrain before pulling up sharply. He aimed his shuttle directly at one of the open drone bay doors. "All for the folks back home," he whispered, and fired his mining laser. The beam, designed to cut through solid rock, lanced into the soft, organic tissue of the bay's interior. There was a screech, not of metal, but of wounded flesh that echoed through the comms. He didn't stop to see the damage. He pulled up, his shuttle's hull screaming from the proximity to the dreadnought's energy field, and banked away, drawing the point defense fire after him. The other shuttles followed suit. As a frantic dance of gnats around a wounded beast, stinging and fleeing. On the ground, the defense was even more savage. The first drone through the airlock was met not by soldiers, but by a geologist named Ilya, who swung a seismic charge on a chain like a pendulum. The charge connected with the drone's head, and the impact, not the explosive, cracked its carapace. Before it could recover, 2 more colonists were on it, jamming plasma cutters into the cracks. The air filled with the stench of burning chitin and the alien creature's death scream. It was a massacre. For every drone the colonists killed, 3 more took its place. The colonists fell one by one, fighting with the ferocity of the damned. A botanist used a hydroponic nutrient sprayer to blind a drone before his wife, a computer programmer, drove a sharpened titanium support rod through its eye. An old couple, married for 40 years, fought back-to-back in a corridor. She with a fire extinguisher, he with a wrench, holding off 3 drones long enough for the children to escape to a deeper section. Their courage was immense, but it was futile. The Krelthian numbers were overwhelming. The synth mind observed it all, a fascinating display of irrational self-sacrifice. It would make a good addition to the archives, a cautionary tale of a species that fought instead of submitting. It was a shame, in a way. They had spirit. But spirit was not a weapon. Then, the ground began to shake, but not from the bombardment. This was a different kind of tremor, deep, resonant, and growing. Deep in the reactor core, Vance looked at Thorne. The temperature was off the scale. The reactor was screaming, on the verge of total collapse. The quantum resonator was glowing with a light that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. "It's now or never, Eris," Vance shouted over the din. Thorne, his face streaked with sweat and grime, made one final adjustment. "The field is keyed to the quantum signature of their FTL drive. I hope. If I'm wrong, we just blow ourselves up." "We were going to do that anyway," Vance said with a grim smile. He placed his hand on the final switch. He thought of his wife, who had died of a fever 3 years ago, and was buried under the soil of this world they had tried to build. He thought of the children hiding in the deepest shelter, their faces filled with terror. He thought of the 230 souls who had trusted him. He looked up at the view screen, which showed a live feed of the Krelthian dreadnought, a monstrous tumor hanging in his sky. He flipped the switch. For a single eternal moment, nothing happened. The reactor's scream reached a fever pitch. The quantum resonator pulsed, and then, reality itself seemed to twist. A wave of invisible energy erupted from the core of Outpost Theta 7. It wasn't heat, or light, or radiation. It was a fundamental disruption of the quantum foam, a localized spasm in the fabric of space-time. It passed through the walls, through the colonists, through the Krelthian drones, and shot upwards towards the dreadnought. The effect on the Krelthian ship was instantaneous and catastrophic. The synth mind, a being of pure consciousness linked to every system of the vessel, felt a sudden shattering pain. Its connection to its own FTL drive, the heart of the ship's power, was severed. But it was more than that. The quantum resonance didn't just disable the drive. It created a feedback loop, a howling, screaming echo that traveled along the quantum pathways that linked this dreadnought to the Krelthian homeworld. In orbit, the dreadnought went dark. Its weapons fell silent. Its organic systems began to spasm and shut down. The drones on the ground froze, their link to the synth mind severed. They were just animals now, confused and lost. Inside the outpost, the survivors, and those still standing, felt the wave pass through them. They felt a moment of profound, indescribable wrongness, and then it was gone. The reactor went silent. The alarm stopped. The only sound was the crackling of fires and the distant, confused chittering of the leaderless drones. Vance and Thorne, slumped against a wall, exhausted and irradiated, stared at the view screen. The dreadnought was dead in orbit, a floating hulk. They had won. They had survived. But Vance's plan was never about survival. "Did it work?" Vance asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Did the signal propagate?" Thorne was checking his instruments, his hands shaking so badly he could barely read them. He looked up, his face a mask of awe and horror. "Yes, Elias," he breathed. "It propagated. The quantum signature. It went out. It was looking for a match. It found one, a big one, a planet-sized one. The resonance it's creating a cascade. Millions of light years away. But in a system the Krelthians had called their own for 10,000 years, the day was beginning. Their homeworld, a majestic planet of towering organic spires and vast, teeming cities, hummed with the usual activity. The synth mind that governed the planet, the apex of their collective consciousness, was contemplating its next expansion. The assault on the primitive human outpost was a minor matter, a task for a single dreadnought. Suddenly, the planet-wide synth mind felt a tremor, a faint, a distant echo in the quantum realm. It was confused. It had never felt anything like it. It was a resonance, a frequency that was intimately, terrifyingly familiar. It was the signature of its own FTL technology, but twisted, screaming. Then, the first FTL drive on the planet's surface, a massive reactor core in the capital city, began to resonate. It vibrated, not physically, but fundamentally. The quantum bonds that held its matter together began to waver. Then another drive resonated. And another, and another. Thousands of them, millions. Every ship in orbit, every transport on the ground, every power core in every city. The cascade was exponential. The human message, born of a dying reactor on a distant, primitive world, had arrived. It wasn't a weapon that delivered force. It was a weapon that delivered a question, a paradox, a flaw in their very existence. It asked their technology to turn in on itself. Across the surface of the Krelthian homeworld, yet the impossible began to happen. Organic spires grown over millennia began to shimmer and dissolve at the edges. The synth mind's consciousness, spread across billions of individual Krelthians, began to fragment, to experience thoughts and sensations that were not its own, echoes of a dying human's final defiant act. In the capital, the great synth mind core, a city-sized brain of organic computing power, was the first to go. It didn't explode. It simply unexisted. One moment it was there, and the next it was a cloud of dissociated atoms, a ghost in the quantum wind. The effect rippled outwards, cities, then continents, then the entire planet began to phase in and out of reality. The Krelthians, for the first time in their history, felt true, individual terror. They screamed, but their screams were swallowed by the quantum storm. And then, in the span of a single human heartbeat, it was over. The Krelthian homeworld was gone. Not destroyed, not shattered, but simply erased from the fabric of reality. Where a thriving ancient empire had stood, there was now only empty space, and a faint residual quantum echo that sounded, to any instrument sensitive enough to detect it, remarkably like a human laugh. Back on Proxima Centauri, the survivors of Outpost Theta-7 emerged from their shelters. They looked up at the dead Krelthian dreadnought hanging in their sky, a monument to their victory. They had no way of knowing what had just happened. They only knew that the attack had stopped, that they were alive, and that they had fought for their home and won. Governor Vance, supported by Dr. Thorne, limped out of the command center and looked at the faces of his people. They were battered, bruised, and grieving for their lost friends and family. But they were alive. The outpost was a wreck, but it still stood. The news of the Krelthian homeworld's disappearance would not reach them for weeks. Carried by a faster-than-light probe sent from a horrified Krelthian fleet that had arrived to find nothing but an empty star. The galactic community, those species who had lived in fear of the Krelthian Empire for eons, would be baffled, then terrified, then awestruck when they pieced together the chain of events. They would learn of a small, insignificant outpost on a backwater world. They would learn of a governor who, facing certain death, chose not to beg, but to warn his own kind about the enemy's arrogance. They would learn of a desperate scientist who jury-rigged a theory into a weapon, and they would learn of a species that, when judged by its tools and found wanting, responded by redefining the very nature of warfare. The Krelthian Empire, for all its power and age, had made a fatal miscalculation. They had seen a primitive colony and thought it an easy conquest. They had not considered that the humans' greatest technology was not their ships or their guns. It was their ability to turn a loss into a lesson, their death into a message, and their defiance into a weapon that could reach across the light years and erase an entire world. The silence from the Krelthian homeworld was the loudest sound in the galaxy. And for every species that heard it, a new question arose, a question they would ponder for generations to come. If you attack a human, if you push them to the very edge of extinction, if you make their last stand truly their last, what might they send back at you? The answer, as the empty space where a proud empire once stood now proved, was absolutely anything. The story of Outpost Theta-7 became legend. It was told and retold on 1,000 human worlds. It wasn't a story of military triumph, but of human spirit. It was a reminder that their strength was not in their fleets, which were still small, but in their hearts, which were boundless. It was the first and loudest declaration that humanity had arrived on the galactic stage, and they would not be judged. They would not be cataloged. They would not be recycled. They were humans, and they would define their own worth. Thank you very much. And somewhere, drifting in the void where a homeworld used to be, a faint quantum echo continued to resonate. A final, defiant message from a few hundred souls who refused to go quietly. It was the ghost of a laugh, the whisper of a warning, and the birth cry of a new power in the universe. A power that had just proven, in the most spectacular way possible, that the greatest threat to an advanced civilization isn't a bigger gun. It's a species that has absolutely nothing left to lose.